Good morning, Pa. It's it's really interesting. I've been really enjoying this, and it's fascinating to me how one of the biggest things it's opening my eyes to is the idea that the regular generic scriptures or the canon that the other churches have um, does provide quite a different lens of how to look at these different stories and other things. Um, because, like, growing up in the Church of Jesus Christ, you have the culture of venerating Eve, of um, really believing in the divinity and goodness of the family. And also, here we've got the internal introspection of how sin affects you. That's a huge one. And I never thought about how important that would be. I thought it was just natural that you should be introspective about how sin and error can affect you on an internal level. I never thought that it just, well, I knew that people would externalize problems. I knew people would be like, well, it's not my fault. So-and-so did it, or that did it, or I've been da-da-da-da-da. And they just externalize it completely, deflect any blame, and don't take any accountability. Like, I knew that. But I never thought of, what if there was a culture of that? What would it look like? And it makes me wonder, like, how... What is the result of living under a culture like that, where all shows of repentance and change are external? I think that's fascinating, because I think that means that there's a lot higher level of tolerance towards screwing up and doing things improperly, and like, it's okay to sit there and, well, no, that's a good question. So, sorry, I was thinking about, what if you had your neighbor who's like, I really hate that neighbor. I want them to drop dead, kind of thing. And you have a real big tiff with your neighbors and you don't care, right? It's pretty awful. But at the same time, it's like, well, as long as I check mark these boxes, I'm good. Whereas when Jesus comes along, he says, if you call your neighbor a fool, you're in danger of hellfire. That you should love your neighbor. It's not a good idea to be on anyone's, to be bad and mean and hold hatred in your heart. That is not okay. That's a totally different level of things. It just makes me wonder how many people actually adhere to the idea that, all that internal bolonky is just bolonky. I'm just fine making sure that I check mark these boxes. So that's an interesting one. I think it would provide for a lot of people who could be quite callous. And I think it could provide for a lot of people to justify how they are, because they're just like, no, I'm taken care of. Whereas Jesus Christ and the Sermon on the Mount, yeah, no, there's like no room to have any excuses. You are doing things wrong anytime you are moved to anger, you are cause pain in other people, anytime that you have desires out of place. It becomes something that hurts your own personal soul, and you should change and be better. And it means that you are always in the wrong in some way or another, but that's okay, because Jesus Christ will help pull you through. It's just a totally, totally different way to approach things. And it's fascinating to think about, okay, all these cultures that I'm reading about and seeing and thinking about, were they built up under the auspices that it should be external, completely, constantly, all the time. It's odd. All right, let's get to the garden paradox, a favorite of atheists. All right. Referring to the Bible's account of the garden, biblical scholar Julie M. Smith writes, "There is a paradox at the center of this story. It almost seems like God set up the whole thing for failure from the get-go. In fact, that is a valid point, because one of Laylee's friends, after we went and did a little temple trip together, we spent a lot of time just talking about doctrinal stuff afterwards. And that was one of their questions, directly. Seems like God set it up for failure from the beginning. Let's see what Jonah has to say. I'll compare it to what I said. God leaves Eve and the fruit in the room together, then turns his back and counts to 10. When the inevitable goes wrong, he returns in outrage. Smith understandably asks, wouldn't God be in some sense responsible for the sin, since Adam and Eve were left alone with a wily serpent and an unguarded tree? People over the centuries have scratched their heads at what almost seems like some kind of pageant. It feels a bit contrived, but their confusion is given no sympathy by the general traditional Genesis account, which hurries on to the cursing of Cain, which also has no shortage of oddities. The implication of Smith's points are dire. If God bears responsibility for the fall, then can he be justified in punishing Adam for it? While shelves of dissertations have been filled analyzing why God created the precarious situation in the garden, traditional Genesis is unconcerned in this version. Adam and Eve are simply told, of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die. The scene is almost Machiavellian in its setup, yet the author of Genesis is not at all interested in the moral consequences of the scene. Not so Lehi. Lehi not only acknowledges the paradox, he spends a large portion of his sermon trying to tease it out. Lehi begins his sermon with the fall of man, and for 5 verses he explains why God was justified in cutting off mankind, until he lands on the answer. The way is prepared from the fall of man. By the law men are cut off, for it must needs be that there is an opposition in all things. If not so, all things must needs be compounded in one. Wherefore there would have been no purpose in the end of its creation. Wherefore man could not act for himself, save it should be that he was enticed by one of the other. That's 2 Nephi 2, 4-5, also 11-12, and 16. Kind of all mashed together. In order to be accountable, Adam and Eve had to have a choice. And for a choice, you need opposition. Whether or not we like this explanation is irrelevant. The point is, Lehi grapples with it while Genesis doesn't. That's his point. The Slavonic Book of Enoch agrees with Lehi that mortality was a test from the beginning. Adam has life on earth, and I created a garden in Eden, in the east, that he should observe the testament and keep the command. The old Slavonic creation of the heavens and the earth puts it simply: the Lord who foresaw everything tests human nature, so that the power of the human mind reveals itself, what he will do, according to his free will. It appears to agree with the account of creation in the book of Abraham, in which God states his purpose. We will prove them herewith, to see if they will do all things whatsoever the Lord their God shall command them. Islam soundly rejects the idea of original sin and doesn't fault God for the strange situation described in Genesis. The Quran places the blame squarely on Adam. Adam disobeyed his Lord, so went astray. One translator of the Quran and Muslim scholar Maulana Muhammad Ali explains the fall outside the King James Genesis and ends up sounding a lot like Lehi. By nature man indeed was created sinless, but by nature he must possess this weakness, whereby he might even be subdued sometimes in the opposition with Satan. This is the whole secret of his progress. If by nature he were made in such a manner that he could never even break God's law, then his state would be like that of the sun, the moon, the stars, etc., which can never deviate in the slightest from their appointed course. But then in no way would man excel over other things. It was therefore necessary that he be placed in a state of confrontation. That's funny, because that's very close to how I would explain things. And of course how Lehi explains things. The only thing I put in there is that the setup is because we have to be separate from God, and that way we can specifically prove that we will choose good of our own free will and choice over evil. Another word for confrontation is opposition. Compare the phrases, "It was therefore necessary that he be placed in a state of confrontation, and for it must needs be that there is an opposition in all things." The Old Testament idea of opposition is that it must be crushed, period. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. That comes from 1 Samuel 2:10. In the New Testament, Christ gives a hint that opposition might at least be educational. "Take my yoke upon you and learn of me." It's Matthew 11:29. This is as close as the traditional canon gets to speaking approvingly of opposition. But Lehi ain't playing. He addresses the elephant in the room immediately in his sermon to his son Jacob. "For it must needs be that there is an opposition in all things. If not so, my firstborn in the wilderness, righteousness could not be brought to pass, neither wickedness, neither holiness nor misery, neither good nor bad." 2 Nephi 2:11. Coming from a guy who survived the empty quarter of Saudi Arabia, that's a heck of a thing to say. He wants his children to know that the opposition in the world is not just necessary, it's good. Righteousness depends on it. Once opposition is present, free will can be exercised. Drawing from the brass plates, Lehi's cosmology divides the world into things that act and things that are acted upon. His son Jacob concludes, "Ye are free to act for yourselves, to choose the way of everlasting death or the way of eternal life. Reconcile yourselves to the will of God." Brigham Young called agency a law that has always existed from eternity. Lehi learns from the brass plates that God went to great lengths to set up the garden for the purpose of preserving Adam's free will. God couldn't push Adam into anything, or it wouldn't be a true test of Adam's character. As Smith rightly points out, it has to be Adam's choice, or God is unjust. While the traditional canon sits silent, the Apocrypha will agree with Lehi. The Egyptian life of Adam and Eve echo Lehi's sentiment when it describes the Lord explaining his punishments to Adam. Quote, "And the Lord said unto Adam and Eve, You transgressed of your own free will, until you came out of the garden in which I had placed you. Of your own free will have you transgressed." And Abu ibn Kathir, one of the most influential Muslim scholars in history, was unfettered by the nutty creedists of Roman Christendom. He ends up sounding just like Lehi. Notice how he moves from God's plan and Satan's guilt to Adam and Eve's agency in the necessity of a test for mankind. Adam's descent on earth, then, was not due to degradation, but rather it was a dignified descent. Allah knew that Adam and Eve would eat of the tree and descend to earth. He knew that Satan would rape their innocence. That experience was essential for their life on earth. It was a cornerstone of their viceregency. It was meant to teach Adam, Eve, and their progeny. Though coming over 1,000 years after Lehi walked the Arabian Peninsula, the Muslims share Lehi's view on the importance of agency. Allah gives his commissioned creatures absolute freedom, even to the extent they can refuse Allah, the Almighty's command. He grants them the freedom of denial, disobedience, and even disagreement with him. As Joseph Smith Jr. revealed, it must needs be that the devil should tempt the children of men, or they could not be agents unto themselves. The doctrine of agency is grounded in the fall story, and the fall story is horribly censored in the Bible. Lehi, Islam, and Joseph aren't stifled by creedist canon. Without an open canon, we get statements like these from men who have chained their brains to anonymous scribes of centuries past. Here's Martin Luther, the lawyerist lawyer who ever Loy-ed, pretzeling his way out of the doctrine of free will. God foreknows nothing by contingency, but foresees, purposes, and does all things according to his immutable, eternal, and infallible will. By this thunderbolt, free will is thrown prostrate and utterly dashed to pieces. When you need to tell people that your statements are the thunderbolt, then they aren't a thunderbolt. Luther's treatise on the bondage of will literally has 5 sections titled First Thunderbolt, Second Thunderbolt, Third Thunderbolt, Fourth Thunderbolt, and Fifth Thunderbolt. No, I'm not kidding. Luther was the type of dude who posed for selfies wearing a fedora. He was the type of dude who just knew that every girl had to have a crush on him. He had a dozen social media personalities whose only purpose was to like his own posts. His email address was theauthenticluther93@aol.com, and he gave it out to everyone, telling them, "Don't give this out to anyone." If Martin Luther was the unbearable class president, John Calvin was the unbearable preacher's kid, also a lawyer. What a shock. Calvin called free will an absurdity. He took a couple of words from a couple of verses from Paul and concluded that there was no such thing as free will. The resulting philosophy is called determinism. Calvin couldn't understand how people could get repentance or choice or agency from the Bible. Quote, How few are there who, when they hear free will attributed to man, do not immediately imagine that he is the master of his mind, and will in such a sense that he can of himself incline himself either to good or to evil. Imagine that. Man has free will. Who could conclude such a silly notion? But don't worry. For all John the Baptist's talk of repenting, for all Joshua's talk of choose ye this day, for all the times God spared Nineveh, or Egypt, or Israel because they changed their ways, no matter. The lawyers are here to remind you that free will is an illusion. And atheists, too. And if you remember my rant when back in the last 116 pages, that bothers me so badly. I think their arguments are annoying and bunk. And anyways, I've already been over that. Listening to Calvin and Luther and others explains away free will brings to mind the words of Brigham Young. All the priests of the day could not tell me anything correct about heaven, hell, God, angels, or devils. They were as blind as Egyptian darkness. When I saw Joseph Smith, he took heaven, figuratively speaking, and brought it down to earth. He took the earth and brought it up, and opened up, in plainness and simplicity, the things of God. The word that withers any theologian is the word that withers any theologian is the word simplicity. The same simplicity drives the academics crazy. When the Apocrypha state things so boldly, so crudely, it makes the doctors inside the doctors bristle. The Old Testament has conditioned us to think in symbols and poetry, types and shadows. But the Book of Mormon and the Apocrypha ain't got time for that. The Greek version of the life of Adam and Eve takes on the idea of free will. In this account, Adam begs the angels, casting him out of the garden, "Leave me that I may entreat the Lord, that he have compassion on me, and pity me, for I only have sinned." The divine investiture of St. Michael says, "On the day when Adam died, the Father looked upon him and wept, saying, Adam, I created you immortal, but you chose mortality." For the extra-biblical accounts, it's plain that Adam acted of his own free will. It's almost like the Nephites never got the memo that reading Scripture could only result in an inaccessible, convoluted philosopher's symposium. The Jews never fell for determinism, thankfully. Perhaps they benefited from some traditions that contained in the brass plates, but later lost to meddling scribes. Not only does the brass plates doctrine of free will inoculate the Nephites against the Calvinist nonsense, it also solves the problem of cosmic injustice. If one ever needs to delve into the philosophical depths of cosmic injustice, one obviously turns to an atheist, British comedian. In an interview with an Irish television station, a British comedian was asked what he would do when confronted with God in the afterlife. The comedian was an atheist, and perhaps the most telling is that he did not answer. "I won't, because I don't think there is a God." Instead, he appealed to the question of cosmic injustice. I would say bone cancer in children. Oh, this is Stephen Fry. Sorry. This is the line that I always remember. Bone cancer in children. I remember this interview. He says, "I won't, because I don't think there is a God." Let me do this properly. I do love Stephen Fry, but I think he is terrible with ideas with his atheism, and his nose is iconic. I would say, bone cancer in children? What's that about? Yes, the world is very splendid, but it also has in it insects whose whole life cycle is to burrow into the eyes of children and makes them blind. They eat outwards from the eyes. Why? Why did you do that to us? You could easily have made a creation in which that didn't exist. It's simply not acceptable. It's perfectly apparent that he is monstrous, utterly monstrous, and deserves no respect whatsoever. Oh, yeah, he even has it in here. Interview with Stephen Fry on RTE, Ireland's National Public Service Media. The Meaning of Life with Gabriel. And yeah, that makes its rounds on the internet. That is definitely like, you hear that once and it sticks with you. This is an argument that an unjust God is no God at all. Yet this argument stands upon the platform of determinism, that God determines everything, that God makes everyone's choices for them. Bone cancer in children is only God's fault, if God determined who gets bone cancer. If God's hand is in everything, and nothing is left to chance or free will or nature, then he bears the blame. But this point is moot. If God allows the world to operate, like Lehi says, without opposition, this thing must needs destroy the justice of God. Without knowing it, this comedian proved Lehi's logic right. A God who owns all agency in the world also owns all the injustice in the world. And a God who owns all the injustice in the world is simply evil. This atheist doesn't deny God's existence, but denies an unjust creature could be revered as God. This comedian is making a very good argument against the strange God of censored canon, but his arguments are crushed by the brass plates, as manifested in the Apocrypha and the Book of Mormon. Knowing that someday people like Martin Luther and John Calvin and some weird British comic would heap blame on him, the Lord tells Adam in the Egyptian Life of Adam and Eve, "O Adam, concerning the tree And had I left you without a commandment, and you had sinned, it would be an offense on my part for not having given you any order. You would turn around and blame me for it. But I commanded you and warned you, and you fell, so that my creatures cannot blame me, but the blame rests on them alone. That is a very good point, and it is structured very well, because I had never thought what would happen in the absence of God giving that commandment. Most people focus on the idea, well, he was set up to fail, and it's like, well, no, he was set up to bring about agency, and God gave the commandments to say, this is the order of things. If you do this, this will happen. If you don't do this, then it doesn't happen. But he has to leave it up to him to choose. Eve figures out the puzzle and goes, well, to get things going, we better take the fruit, even though she knows it's going to cause these problems. And yes, it's against these commandments. To me, it was never trying to set him up for failure. It was trying to set up opposition. It was trying to set up choice. But I've never considered the question from the opposite. I never considered the question of, what if he just sat there and did it, but didn't tell him about consequences? Just said, nope, here's this and here's that. You don't, these are the consequences, and or these are not, he gives no consequences whatsoever. He protects the fruit tree of knowledge of good and evil, and then it's like, whoa, you set me in here. You didn't tell me that this was going to happen. That's unfair. Because it would be unfair. Because God would have given no warning. And then it would have more blamed on him. But now that God can sit there and say, I gave you warning, and it was your choice. It has to be. And that's the way it needs to be. It's a situation where his hands are tied, because again, the point is that he needs to be on the line of perfection, which means he has to set it up this way, and he has to give them consequences and tell them beforehand, but leave it up to them to choose. Even though the true progression forward is down into a fallen world, so that there is opposition in all things, so that we can be tested, so that we can choose right over wrong and good over evil. But I never considered it. That's fascinating. What if God never gave Adam warning? Wow, that's cool. The Egyptian life of Adam and Eve goes on to tell the story of our first parents learning to farm. Adam and Eve reaped some grain bushels and filled the bucket of water to drink. In the story, Satan tips over the bucket, burns up the grain, and gets Adam and Eve lost on their way home. In the story, it's the devil's personal doing, but the cause for the mishap is irrelevant, whether it is by Satan's intervention or just the injustices of existence. Adam questions the meaning of suffering, or what Dostoevsky calls the tears of humanity with which the earth is soaked from its crust to its center. Listen to Adam put on this atheist hat, or Calvinist hat. O God, you have burnt and taken from us the corn. You have given us, and you have emptied out the bucket of water, and you have sent your angels, who have caused us to lose our way from the cornfield. Will you make us perish? If this be from you, O God, then take away our souls, but punish us not. God's response is nothing like the Bible, but much more like Lehi's cosmology. Then God said to Adam, I did not burn down the wheat, and I did not pour the water out of the bucket, and I did not send my angels to lead you astray. But now, O Adam, you shall acknowledge my good deeds done to you. Ooh. In Mosiah 24, the people of Alma are made slaves to the Amulonites, which the brass plates doctrine of with the brass plates doctrines for their foundations. They don't curse God and die. They don't pin the blame on God. The world is just harsh. Instead of murmuring, the people of Alma pray, and God answers. I will also ease the burdens which are put upon your shoulders, that even you cannot feel them upon your backs, even while you are in bondage. And this will I do, that ye may stand as a witness for me hereafter. Mosiah 24:14. Another story from the Apocryphal Armenian. So, in that point, that's showing that God may not be the cause of all the bad things, but he will give the blessings to help relieve the burden. And in this case, he just made them stronger. That's it. But it's enough. It's what gets the job done. One thing I wanted to go back to. Okay, let's finish that off and I'll get back to it. Answering the question about bone cancer in children, that kind of stuff. Another story from the Apocryphal Armenian Penitence of Our Forefather Adam describes how the angels delay the expulsion of Adam from the garden after being told to kick Adam and Eve out. Oh, really? Adam pleads with the angelic bouncers, and they have pity on him. God then asks the angels rhetorically, "Why have ye ceased from driving Adam from paradise? Why do ye not cast him out? Is it I who have done wrong? Or is my judgment badly judged?" Again, God asks his angels rhetorically, "Were the sin mine? Do I pronounce judgment in vain?" The angels reply, "You are just, O Lord, and your judgments are upright." To drive this point home, Lehi creates a logical proof. The desert prophet concludes his argument with this statement: "And if there be no righteousness nor happiness, there be no punishment nor misery. And if these things are not, there is no God. And if there is no God, we are not, neither the earth, for there could have been no creation of things, neither to act nor be acted upon, wherefore all things must have vanished away." 2 Nephi 2:13. If God compels everything, then his punishments and rewards are arbitrary, capricious, and unjust. The traditional canon leaves this theological landmine primed, but Lehi snuffs it out with his help of the fall story on the brass plates. Lena, you are interrupting. What do you need?
I was waiting for you to finish it.
I am not going to be finished for a few minutes. Get to the point.
So my question was, can I bring this book to school? Because I decided I want to reread it, because at first I wasn't even trying reading, but now I'm really into reading, so I would like to try and read this again.
That's fine. So do you see how pristine this is?
Yes.
Do you know what will kill this book? If you throw it in your backpack, you will bend the pages if you throw it in your backpack. You need to keep it in very good order. I have no problem with that.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.
Okay, I love you. Bye-bye. No, just stop. Go. I love you.
Bye.
If God compels everything, then his punishments and rewards are arbitrary, capricious, and unjust. The traditional canon leaves this theological landmine primed, but Lehi snuffs it out with the help of the fall story on the brass plates. The author of the Book of Mormon shows the and honestly, that was Satan's plan. It was make us automatons, but that doesn't make us become better. If we are forced with no free will to do the will of the God that made us, then we are not for ourselves choosing good over evil, and we are proving to no one, nowhere at all, in any way, that we can become like God, where we of our own choice and free will choose good and are good. But yeah, so Lehi snuffs this out. The author of the Book of Mormon follows the Apocrypha in this philosophy. The Lord justifies his expulsion of the first couple by saying, oh, by the way, footnote, Joseph Smith Jr. revealed these two copacetic theologies and never bothered to point it out to anyone. If he was a con artist, he was a poor one. Yeah, a lot of times if Joseph Smith was the one that made all this, like, of himself, and he didn't sit there and harp on it or point it out, it's kind of like, it's just silly. to me, it's like there's so much that was just pouring out from God's hand and God's command, and that Joseph Smith was like drinking from a fire hose, because this was all new to him, like completely. And on top of that, there's so much that he missed. He just couldn't have been aware. Like, we haven't so much time to sit here and ruminate, because what was started becomes culture and passed on. And then from that culture and passed on knowledge, we can then build on it and look deeper and find more. And then again, that becomes culture and not common knowledge. And then it can be built on and refined more. It's fascinating how it works that way. But here's the quote: "For I, the Lord God, liveth, even so my words cannot return void. For as they go forth out of my mouth, they must be fulfilled. So I drove out the man." Moses 4:30 through 31. This matches the apocryphal accounts and Lehi wrestling with the justification for the expulsion. Ultimately, they all agree that Adam was a free agent, and to spare Adam would mean God's word would be in vain or return void, or as Lehi puts it, must have vanished away. Drawing from the brass plates, the Nephite prophets didn't shy away from direct fourth-wall breaking sermonizing, while the traditions of Judah expressed themselves as in coy, pantomime type of preaching. The Josephites grabbed a folding chair from the front row and drove from the third rope onto the hardest theological questions. Wrestling. So they grabbed the chair, bounced off the walls, and wham, slam the chair, and drove from the third rope onto the hardest theological questions. The brass plates, dove. Oh, okay. They grabbed dove from the third rope. Oh, sorry. Body slam. Either way. Dove from the third rope onto the hardest theological questions. The brass plates didn't shy away from wrestling with our mortal probation. The fortunate fall, the interiority of repentance, the paradox in the garden, the need for opposition, or the eternal principle of agency and justice. Like its brass daddy, the Book of Mormon is fearless, and its cousins in the Apocryphal corpus are too. End of chapter 4. And that's the QR code. Next is, "This isn't the Messiah you're looking for." Dude, that'll be a good one. Okay, so I think Jonah did a great job of explaining a lot of amazingly important and good tenets of both the Book of Mormon and the Apocrypha and what it has over the regular canon. I think and he summed it up really well at the end there, the internalization of repentance, that the garden paradox was made in this way because, God had to remain being perfect, but yet he needed to give agency to man. So he has to set it up that you have a choice, but here are the clear consequences. I never considered the idea from the opposite end of what if God did not clearly state the consequences, then it would have been God's fault, and that would have been bad. And so by leaving it this way, yes, in a way it's set up for failure, but it's not meant to be a failure. It's meant to be, this is the starting line. You get to make your first choices, and it's on you. And not only is it your first choices and it's on you, it is also, it means that it was done through personal choice. And this is where I wanted to bring it back to the, bone cancer in children and bugs that eat up people's eyes by atheists. Because in some ways, Jonah Barnes goes on, he touches on that, but he says, look, you see, this is why the regular canon is terrible, because if you think of God as being someone who is the creator of all things and is the one that caused all this to happen, all this bad stuff, then he's terrible and he should have no respect at all. And in a very good way, he is right. Basically, Jonah Barnes says, well, he's really just saying someone who is in charge of all that wouldn't be worthy of respect. And in that way, he's right. And he is. Because in some ways, if it was like Satan's plan, where we had no choice and we had to go through this suffering for no good reason, then he's not a good and just God. But the reason that does not apply in this case to the real God. Could the real God please stand up? Anyway, the reason that logic doesn't apply in the same way is because it was a free choice of each of us. And I think that's really important. That in Adam and Eve's case, they were told of the consequences. In the same way, I'm certain that all of us were told of the consequences beforehand. I mean, that's the whole point of the pre-earth life organization, that God basically said, look, this is the world that we live on. This is the way we live here. But you have to understand, you need to have opposition so that you can learn good from bad for yourself. And more importantly, not only learn it, not only have experience with it, but to, most importantly, choose good over evil. So that you can become the children of God and heirs with Christ. But the point I'm trying to make is that we consented as well. Like the idea of a pre-existence and the idea of consenting to come down to this world of unjust terribleness is the only thing that can make sense. Because if we're just arbitrarily made, if we're just arbitrarily thrown down here to suffer, even with the plan of salvation and stuff, there's things that never sit well with me if that's just the case, that just happens. For example, those who are handicapped, there is a very big disconnect that bothers me, that you bothered, past tense, me for a long time. Because there's plenty of members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that have children with special needs. They're autistic or they have Down syndrome. They are normal people. Sorry about that knocking. I have no idea who's doing that. But when their children were given patriarchal blessings, from what I understand, a lot of them say that they were special spirits, or they're here and they're being protected. And phrases like that, that's commonly what I've heard. Have I seen those patriarchal blessings with my own two eyes? No. But I have reason to believe and rely on the witness and testimony of the people who have worked with those with special needs and their parents and caretakers who have had that experience. But why did it bother me that those phrases were in there? Because I always thought that was rubbish. Like, I really thought that was rubbish. And here's why, and followed by why here I think it is right. Because God is just, and there's like 3 specific points that are going to play to this. Plus, I always thought it was rubbish how parents and caretakers of special need would be like, their love was always so special. It was always so wonderful and kind and sweet. And I'm like, are you kidding me? These kids that reach in their pants and get poo on their hands and then try and slap you, bite you, kick you, throw chairs at you, burn you, pull your hair, you think their love is special. Their love is kind. Their love is sweet. They're not. They're wonderful people. They have a great love for them, and they do. But to me, it's like, no, objectively, children with special needs are a burden. They cause a lot more chaos, pain, and harm to themselves, to their family members, They have greater costs. They have problems with being able to interact fully. There's just objectively, they are harder in every way. They are not easier. It's not easier on them. Their life is not easier on themselves, let alone anyone else. They are easily influenced to do inappropriate things constantly, and other kids will know that and teach them to do inappropriate things for fun, and it's horrible. It's not a fun and easy existence. So that is my atheist kind of you have to look at objectively, this is bad and this is poor. So why do they have this? The reason the patriarchal blessing always bothered me is it's like, how is this a protection to them? They are objectively going through something worse than I do in some ways. They're objectively having a harder life. Because they don't process things the same, they are subject to the cruelty of the world with less understanding about it. Instead of being able to grapple with the concept that, sometimes life sucks, but this is a way that you can learn and become stronger, and because you can follow the, commandments of Jesus Christ, it makes your life better and blessed. And they don't get the rewards of having a better life and a greater understanding. That is something that's kind of just beyond their understanding. But where do all these different components come in to solidify into a cohesive theological idea? It comes to this. They objectively have it harder. Their life is harder. So how are they being protected? The idea of justice is that whatever light and knowledge that you obtain to in this life is what you can be judged by. So people who go without the full gospel cannot be judged by the standards of the full gospel, but they can be judged by whatever light and knowledge they can obtain, which means that if they know that, hey, kicking dirt in the eye of this guy is causing undue suffering, I shouldn't do that. Obviously, murder is almost universally abhorred. And so there's very little to justify that anywhere that you go. But that's why God is the judge, because it gets really messy when people don't have the full law or the full gospel. And okay, so if you apply that to someone who is of diminished capacity, you then have someone who is protected by that same standard of law. They are of diminished understanding. This means that they may not have the full extent of understanding all the specifics and details. They may only get the basics. They may only get the primary stuff that they can do repeatedly and through repetition and basics in understanding and how they are treated. Because that's another thing. I think they're a big, huge test for everyone around them, that how you treat them is how you will be treated, which is a high-stakes game, because it is harder. And so because they have that diminished capacity, and because that diminished capacity means that they do give in to inappropriate behavior constantly, can they be held accountable for that? No. It shields them in a way. And it's rough, but that makes sense. That's the only way I've seen that to be just, that they're being protected according to their patriarchal blessings, or that they are special, or other things like that. But they're living an objectively harder life, and they're leading a life of less accountability. And it's one that is a greater burden for themselves and those around them. But yet, it means that when it comes to judgment time, it's like, yeah, you were handicapped, literally. Because of that handicap, more mercy can have more sway. But then the question becomes, well, why give it to them at all? That's the crux of the atheist point. Why even have those flies? Why even give bone child, have the opportunity to have children have bone cancer, or have giant earthquakes and tsunamis sweep away people and destroy villages and lives and haunt people for generations? Why even have anything like that? As God says, this is a fallen world. These things will happen here. Badness does not have to be, well, God did this earthquake or God did that. There are times where I think there is God behind certain natural disasters because it calls it out when God's punishing them, or that those things happen because of justice. So, but there's plenty of times where it's just, there are other times where it happens, or it's because of just people. So, what does this conclude with? Why does this stuff happen? What if beforehand God showed us all and said, look, this is the plan. It is rough. It will be unjust. Period. There's nothing about this that will be fair. You will suffer these diseases, these horrific things that make children blind, give them bone cancer. There is suffering. You will come to a diminished capacity body. You may be missing arms and legs or limbs, or suffer scarlet fever, or all the different horrors of the world. You will, or there's the guy who goes around who's, I think he had problems during his development in the womb, and so he doesn't have arms and he doesn't have legs. He's just his torso and head, and he's really cool because he shows a positive attitude and he goes around giving speeches and such to help people see their lives better, and it's very impactful, and that kind of thing. He went to a life like that, and all those children who have diminished capacity, they came to those bodies. Now, you could sit there and have the view of, oh, it was all random, and that makes it pretty bad, right? It makes it like, well, why even have that? But again, that patriarchal blessing stuff gave a window into, it was a choice. It was a choice. Whether God was doing it and saying, hey, because of what you were like or how you were like or what happened beforehand, you can come into this world and into a diminished capacity body for protection. I don't know if that was out of pity, like, if you're worried about not being able to make it, or you've already had it hard enough, we could do it this way. It means that you will have greater struggles and you will have to suffer through these things, but the justice on the other end is this, and they accepted it. That is the thing that makes the difference, is our choice. Just like with Adam in the Garden of Eden. And I think that's why it is such an important key thing, is if you think of the Garden of Eden as similar to pre-existence, the choice that Adam made to come down and basically receive a body, to go through the lone and dreary world, was a choice that we all make. For Adam and Eve, it was, you had the garden scenario first, and then you came down. For us, it was, we had the pre-earth life. We could see what was going on. We can see everything that was happening. And we still chose to come down. And I thank God, because of the preservation of our choices, our free will, because that is the point, is that we must have our free will. Must. Above all other things, we have to choose. That we cannot be denied. And it solves so many problems, because the whole bone cancer in children and terribleness that's around here, yes, it is because this world is unjust. But it doesn't mean that God created it himself. It wasn't at God's direction. It was because it is a fallen world, and yes, these things are allowed to happen. And yes, it is set up that way to allow these things to happen, so that we must, because to preserve our agency, We must have opposition in all things. We must have these things occur so that we of ourselves can learn good from evil and become like God, and to choose good over evil, to prove to him that we can become his sons and daughters. It completes that whole cycle. The only other thing that would have been brought up by Alex O'Connor and other atheists is the suffering of animals, because, for people who consent to all this, then that makes sense. But what about the animals? Do they consent? The only answer, even though I can't think of any scriptures that actually back this up, is the idea that similarly, of their own free will and choice for what lives and intelligence they had beforehand, they chose to come through here to fulfill the measure of their creation, to receive rewards according to their journey. It's probably something similar to what we're going through, but at a different scale. Or it could be that they don't have the same type of consciousness. Hard to say. I have a little bit more doubt on the consciousness argument, only because, you look at cats and dolphins and deers and dogs and basically most vertebrate mammals, you can sit there and go, oh, they're cute, and they respond to kindness, and they can have personalities. Like, you just watch huskies online. They're drama queens. So, and cats are often drama queens too. So I think that they have their own similar plan of salvation type thing going for them. We just don't have the specifics, because mostly we're trying to focus on what we've got here. But if it follows the same pattern, then it means that they of their own choice decided beforehand, yeah, let's do this. If I get to live like this in the afterlife, or I have this reward by going through this misery, then sure, let's go for it. That's it again. It completes things. And so all those little horrible, that tangle that I had helped to be resolved through having me realize that choice beforehand. I was also influenced by a vision of Brother Schultz from On My Mission. And it helped resolve a lot of things, because that's the idea. We consented beforehand. But the important thing is that we don't remember, so we can truly choose. Because if we always remembered everything beforehand, it taints the test of, can you really choose of yourself, with or without all the perfect guidance or not, to choose the better part. Sorry, that's the key note that I'm dong harping on all the time. But love you lots, Pa. This is really cool. It opens my eyes to so much about how other religions operate, how much we already have in our culture, and especially understanding that what if God didn't give the consequences beforehand? How that would have changed things. Cool stuff. See you next time.